Dr. Ngozi is the 7th Director General of the World Trade Organization. She took office on the 1st of March, 2001 as the first woman and the first African to serve as a Director General. For the last 30 years, she has been a global finance expert, an economist, and international development professional working in Asia, Africa, Europe, Latin America, and North America. Dr. Ngozi was formerly chair of the board of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. She was previously on the boards of Standard Chartered PLC and Twitter. She was appointed as the African Union Special Envoy to mobilize international finance support for the fight against COVID-19. She was previously Nigerian's finance minister, and she briefly acted as the foreign minister as well. She was the first woman to hold both positions in Nigeria. She has had a 25-year career at the World Bank as a development economist. And it is a great honor to have this conversation with you at the Kennedy School of Government here at Harvard for the African Policy Journal. I'm Enito Kediji, and I welcome you all to this conversation. We will touch on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, gender equity in international trade, and the WTO reforms. So Dr. Ngozi, since you took over at the WTO, you have championed gender empowerment. Can we discuss what this means and how trade policies and practices can be used to advance gender equity and empower women economically? So far, what has the WTO done to promote gender equity in international trade?
Well, thank you, Anito, and congratulations on the work you're doing for the Policy Journal. Let me say that I regard gender empowerment in trade as very important because it's one of the ways in which you can foster inclusion. We know that there are people who are marginalized, in the global economy. Small and medium enterprises sometimes don't get onto global and regional value chains, and women also. We did a study with the World Bank, that's the WTO and the World Bank, where we saw that women who work in export industries tend to make maybe twice as much as those who do not. So clearly, trade is a facilitator to enhanced income. So this is why we think it's important to look at how to strengthen the rules, because the WTO is a global rulemaking organization, but so far the multilateral rules have not reflected the issue of gender. And for the first time, there's been an agreement negotiated here at the WTO on this for services trade called the Services Domestic Regulation Agreement, and SDR agreement. And 67 or so of our members are involved in negotiating this. So it's a plurilateral. But what I'm speaking about it is that for the first time, it has a clause that ensures that women are not discriminated against in the services provision, in the services industry. And I think we are quite proud of that. I think that will be a precursor. So that's for global rules. But now let's get down to, sort of a more concrete level. We also need to help women with supply side issues, because many of them have issues of not having access to trade finance, for instance, access to knowledge, access to how to penetrate markets. And we have another part of the WTO, an organization, a subsidiary, if you will, called the International Trade Center, that is jointly owned by WTO and UNCTAD. And they look very specifically at these issues. How can we work with women to improve the quality of the products that they manufacture so that they can enter both regional and international markets? So, for instance, in Nigeria, they worked with women in a shea butter cooperative with their sanitary and phytosanitary conditions so that they can penetrate the European and American markets, and they succeeded. So we can also work at a very concrete level with women. And so these are the things we are trying to do. Supply side, let's help them specifically. Global rules, let's try to also help them in that way.
That's fantastic. Let's move to the subject of the AFCFTA. The significance cannot be overstated. It is the world's largest new free trade area since the establishment of the World Trade Organization in 1994. So now there's an ongoing discussion for an agreement on investments in phase 2 of the AFCFTA. Given the experiences at the WTO and the specific needs of Africa in this regard, what are the key pain points that the coming agreement must address to accelerate, scale, and make cross-border investment work for inclusive economic growth and the people?
Well, first of all, let me agree with you that the African Continental Free Trade Area is, by number of countries, the largest in the world. You know, with all the African countries, all 55 of them, 54 of them as members, this is the largest free trade area. It has 1.4 billion people. So the potential for a large market is there. And this is why it is so interesting and so promising. But to make it work, I believe I have to say kudos, because I believe that the AFCTA protocols, countries have ratified, most of them have ratified the protocol. Most of them are trying to, see if they can complete negotiations of certain aspects of the AFCTFA that is necessary for it to begin to work. They need to look at issues like rules of origin, for instance, and negotiate agreements on that, on tariffs. I think they've agreed already to remove tariffs on 90% of products that will be traded within the area. So I think there are specific ways, things that are needed to make the market work. And I believe the Secretariat is working with countries to negotiate those. They've actually also started what they call guided trade between 8 countries, just to test out if it's going to work. So that's also a good thing. But I think we need to speed up. Some of the things we need to do is to look at trade costs on the continent. You know, the trade costs on the African continent are equivalent to a 354% tariff, which is much higher. It's saying that it costs so much to trade on the continent. So we have to look at what are those things in the way. How do we put in place a trade facilitation agreement so that we remove all the barriers that are blocking us? Of course, we have to look at both physical and bureaucratic barriers. And you know, physically, we still have the phenomenon of crossing borders, trucks waiting for days. You know, the logistical challenges, the infrastructure challenges, those have to be looked at and dealt with. Otherwise, we will have a problem. Also, the bureaucratic challenges, which is what I mean by trade facilitation. You need agreement so that all those will also be dealt with. If we don't deal with those trade costs, then making the Continental Free Trade Area work the way it should is going to be quite difficult. Let me just say one more thing for the trade to work. Intra-Africa trade is about 15 to 16%. Africa's trade, Africa's shelf trade with the rest of the world is slightly less than 3%. I think these are very small numbers. So I would say that if we need to focus on how can we increase the volume and value of trade amongst ourselves, and we can only do that by adding value to the products we trade. We can't all be trading primary commodities to each other. So how do we set up manufacturing capacity? How do we specialize some countries or on certain sectors, you know, so we can add value to products and increase the value and volume of trade amongst ourselves? When we do that, we can also increase with the rest of the world. So these are some of the things. You know, it's not good enough to just have a free trade area if you don't have things you trade that add value and create jobs for young people. So those are some of the areas we need to look. And the WTO has been working through the African Union to actually support several African countries in looking at these obstacles and how to take care of them, in adopting the necessary protocols that they are negotiating. Many of these are based on WTO rules and conventions. So we've been trying to support them in that as well.
I like that the African Union is involved. You're known to be a very firm believer in the power of trade, and just from listening to you now, I can tell, and I'm sure people listening can also tell, that you're a firm believer of trade and the power of it to lift developing countries out of poverty and also assist them to achieve robust economic growth and sustainable development. You have mentioned that the WTO must work for the people, which seems to be your key goal in your leadership as the Director General. How do you achieve this in the context of strained discussions on the Doha round, which was actually supposed to make global trade work more effectively for developing countries?
Well, you're absolutely right that, there was the Doha round, I think, which was supposed to have been complete. I think it's in 2001, but, negotiations fell apart and developing countries felt very bad about it because they felt that previous agreements did not adequately represent the interests of developing countries. Some of them were not even around the table at the times those agreements were put in place. You talk of the WTO coming into being in 1994, but remember that it was preceded by the GATT, which dates back all the way to post-war World War II. 1945, it was created with the IMF and the World Bank. So there's a 75, 76-year history. And many of the countries were not even independent, so they felt their interests were not taken into account. So the Doha round was supposed to be a development round. Now, it didn't, there was too much disagreement and it fell apart. And you can still feel at the WTO the distrust of developing country members for developed, feeling that they were let down. So what do we have to do? It is difficult to recreate the round. So we have to look at how do we serve developing countries more, even in the absence of the completion of this round. And I think that the best approach that I've seen since I came is to look at those particular agreements that will be very beneficial to developing countries and try to tackle them one by one. An example is the trade facilitation agreement that was reached in Bali, because it helps to remove all those barriers to trade and make things flow more easily. So it's those kinds of agreements. So this time we have several that were supposed to have been dealt with under the Doha round, like the agriculture agreement that is still pending. We had the fisheries subsidies agreement, that $22 billion in fisheries subsidies that is leading to overfishing of the waters of developing countries and undeveloped, overfishing of our seas and oceans. We managed to get an agreement in June at our 12th ministerial, the first sustainability agreement that the WTO has signed on to. Many developing countries will benefit from it. The most excited countries were the Pacific Islands, the Caribbean, many coastal countries in Africa and so on. They were really keen. So we're very proud of that. It delivers SDG 14.6, and we have a second phase to look at the remaining issues under the agreement. Then I just also want to cite something we did which benefits developing countries, which is during this pandemic, we were able to negotiate a TRIPS waiver agreement to allow developing countries to be able to temporarily waive patents so they can manufacture the COVID medicines. This means we have to set up our own manufacturing pharmaceutical industry. So in Africa, for instance, where we were importing 99% of our vaccines and 90% of our other pharmaceuticals, this agreement will allow those countries that are able to set up the capacity, maybe partner with other pharmaceutical countries to set up. We have Aspen Pharmacare in South Africa that took advantage of this. So we need to look at those kinds of things. I think those are very specific type of agreements that benefit people. I hope we can do more and more of that. We are now looking at how can we unbundle, what can we do to get the agricultural agreement signed, agreed to by everybody, because agriculture obviously benefits developing countries. So that's what I think we do now. Let us take issue by issue. Digital trade. The future of trade, I always say, services is green, is digital. Digital trade, we have many young people in our countries who are, very tech savvy, and they are developing businesses, that are technology based. But do we have rules that underpin e-commerce? The answer is no. We must develop those rules to make sure that all our people who are doing digital trade in the developing countries will have level playing field, predictable trade, and that's not what we have now. So we have an e-commerce plurilateral negotiations with about 87 members going on now. And if we can finish that will help us do something that I think will be beneficial to developing countries, especially women and SMEs who are going digital.
So let's talk a bit about globalization. Many people believe that globalization might be over. There's a renowned economist here at Harvard, Jason Foreman, who argues that globalization is something to watch out for in 2023. Deglobalization is something to watch out for in 2023. But we know that there could be both challenges and opportunities coming out from that. How can African nations strategically position themselves to take advantage of reshoring? And is there a way for WTO to assist and provide some capacity building support to facilitate this process?
I think that's a very good question, because the subject is so topical. We just came from Davos, where this issue of deglobalization, fragmentation was really one of the central topics. And the interesting thing is that we've done quite a lot of work on this issue at the WTO. There's a lot of talk of decoupling, fragmentation, deglobalization. The era of globalization is over. Before I comment on that, let me remind that globalization lifted over 1 billion people out of poverty. Most of them were in East Asia, especially China, but even all around the world, this happened. So we shouldn't forget that there were very good benefits. It also brought, trade is disinflationary. It also brought cheaper consumer goods to people in rich countries. So we shouldn't forget all of that. That being said, yes, we know there were poor people in rich countries who were left behind, and poor countries who were left behind. And people now feel, oh, the era of globalization is over, because when they look at trade to GDP ratios, global trade to GDP, they see that this is stagnating. And they also read that to mean that this is over. The geopolitical tensions that we observe now lend a lot of credence to this. So yes, we can say there are a lot of geopolitical tensions. We can say that there's a lot of talk about decoupling and fragmentation, but our economists showed that if we fragment, it's going to be very costly for the world. They actually did a simulation. If the world breaks into 2 trading blocks, what would that mean? And we found that it would mean a 5% loss in global GDP, decrease in global GDP in the longer term. This is like saying we lose the whole economy of Japan. That's huge. So this is, and it comes from loss of economies of scale and technological spillovers, which benefit mostly emerging market and developing countries. So developing countries will suffer even more. They might suffer double-digit GDP losses, up to 12%. So if you look at that, the question then becomes, let's not really get into this issue of decoupling or fragmentation. People are talking about the vulnerabilities we saw in supply chains during the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, which is true. And that's leading to what you talked about, friendshoring. So they're saying the new wave of globalization should be friendshoring, nearshoring, reshoring. So reshoring, you're bringing the manufacture of goods home. Nearshoring, you're sending them to nearby countries. And friendshoring, you're sending them to friends. But like I always said, we don't know who is a friend. A friend today can become a non-friend tomorrow. So what we're advocating, and now this is coming to the point that we're referring to, is why don't we try to build global resilience by not just talking about friendshoring and nearshoring, but looking wide and saying, what were those geographies and those countries and those people left out of the first wave of globalization? Why don't we build our supply chains in such a way they can be built in these countries, in these geographies that were left out. So that's what we are advocating, and we're calling it re-globalization. Now, Africa can benefit from that. It won't happen to you if you just sit still waiting. There are countries that are actively packaging themselves and saying, look, we've got the right economic environment for you to invest in. We have good macroeconomic management. We have less bureaucracy. We are friendly to investment. So I think many African countries should quickly look at themselves. Some of them have the right conditions to attract this. And that is how we can benefit from what some people see as an unfortunate development, but it can be turned around to be a positive.
Thank you. So lastly, I agree with you that some African countries have the right conditions, but it also seems that some of them might need some technical assistance and capacity building programs. And I want to know what does the WTO offer to African countries to really help them take full advantage of the organization's rules and disciplines, as well as build a successful continental agreement that delivers?
Well, look, we have several capacity building facilities at the WTO, and they're mostly built for the benefit of least developed countries and developing countries when they require it. So we have some facilities that help countries to implement the agreements that have already been reached. So this fisheries subsidies agreement, we have a fund that we just started, a fisheries fund that we have. I think we're shooting for about $20 million. We're almost at 10. And any country that needs help implementing the agreement and improving its fisheries management capacity can apply to the fund. Similarly, people need support to implement the trade facilitation agreement, their capacity building funds to do that. Like I told you before, we've built the capacity of many countries to participate in the African Continental Free Trade Area. We just spent about 3.5 million Swiss francs helping several of our countries to be able to understand the protocols and sign up to them, implement them, do whatever the necessary things are, technical work that is needed. So yeah, we have, and we do a lot of training. Many government officials do come to the WTO for internships and so on for a period of time so they can understand how the place works, the trade rules, what the country needs to do to be able to abide by these rules, etc. So yes, we have a lot of ability to build capacity, and we're actually doing it.
Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Ngozi. This has been very insightful, deeply honored. And on behalf of the African Policy Journal and also the Harvard community, I say thank you. This will definitely be shared to the Harvard community. So as a way of signing out, we usually go with the theme, the Africa I Want. And so we'd like you to say, what Africa looks like for you in the coming years, by saying the Africa I want is.
The Africa I want is one that creates jobs for our very talented youth. The Africa I want is a continent in which we are able to feed ourselves, create jobs, and live a happier and more prosperous life free of conflict.
Thank you, Ma.
Thank you, Anito. Take care.
Thank you. Have a great day. Bye.
Bye-bye.